Morning, everybody. Hi, I'm Julian Haida. I am the Newmark Journalism Scholar at the Global Cyber Alliance. And we're really excited to join you, the Global Cyber Alliance, today, along with some really special guests, to talk a little bit about the challenges in journalism and also some of the potential to build up journalism in this new, fast-changing world. I know it's the Online News Association. Online News Association has been around for a really long time, but every conference, it seems like there's a lot of people who are talking about the challenges, and we're going to present you with some solutions. There's also been a lot of really interesting conversations about ways that journalists can protect themselves, some narrow conversations, and we're going to broaden it out because cybersecurity is something that is important to everybody in journalism, and we're going to explain some of the reasons why that is, and we're also going to show you some of the ways that journalists can protect themselves. So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague. Her name is Megan Stiefel, and we have a very exciting toolkit to show the journalism community, to share with the journalism community, to get feedback from the journalism community, and use this thing so that all of us can be protected a little bit better, since what we do is pretty important. So Megan, I'd like for you to tell us what we have, what we want to share this morning with the Online News Association and the journalism world writ large.
Thanks very much, Julian. So as Julian mentioned, my name is Megan Stiefel. I'm the Executive Director of the Americas at the Global Cyber Alliance. I'm also the Director of the Craig Newmark Philanthropies Trustworthy Internet and Democracy Program. So you may be wondering, what is the Global Cyber Alliance, GCA as we affectionately call ourselves, and why are we here today? GCA is an international nonprofit organization. We were founded 5 years ago by 2 law enforcement entities and a global cybersecurity best practices organization. Our mission was given to us to reduce cybersecurity risk globally. Since our founding, we've grown to over 150 partner organizations in over 30 countries around the world. These partners come from all sectors, including other nonprofits, academia, government, and industry. We advance our mission by uniting global communities, scaling cybersecurity solutions, and measuring their impact. We focus on making cybersecurity accessible to all by supporting free resources and training people on how to use them, which brings me to why we're here today. Today, GCA is launching a resource for this community, a cybersecurity toolkit for journalists. It's the second toolkit we've developed with the generous support of Craig Newmark Philanthropies and a core component of our Trustworthy Internet and Democracy program. The toolkit is the outcome of many months of work, discussion, and revision. It includes 7 toolboxes to help users implement core cyber hygiene practices, such as updating software, backing up data, using complex, unique passwords, MFA, and protective DNS services, among others. The toolkit also contains explainer videos on why it's essential to take the recommended actions. We also created a community forum. where users can ask questions about the tools and benefit from the knowledge of others in the forum. Finally, we're developing a series of modules as an element of our learning management system to help users deepen their understanding of these key security actions. Now, I think it goes without saying that journalists need to really heighten their cybersecurity in this particularly tumultuous year. We have some recent examples of Angolan journalists who are reporting on embezzlement, having their devices compromised. Likewise, two journalists in Turkey similarly were found to have their devices compromised in the process of their undertaking their reporting. So without further ado, we look forward to hearing your feedback and collectively advancing a more secure and trustworthy internet. After all, news is developed, shared, and made online. Now more than ever, it is critical that cybersecurity is an essential element as journalists work to inform the public and protect democracy. Thanks very much to our fantastic panelists who are here today, and especially to our journalism scholar, Julian Haida.
Well, thanks, Megan. This is really exciting. Tell people where they could find the toolkit. We want people to play with it. We want people to kind of use some of the tools. Where can people find this thing?
So it's gcatoolkit.org/journalists.
So feel free, as all of you are watching our presentation, go to gcatoolkit.org/journalists and click through it, see what you think, see what you use, see what you don't use. And we're going to be taking some questions with our panelists, who I'm about to introduce at the end. Feel free to ask those questions about why certain approaches are had, why it's important to use one tool versus the other. We want this to be as inclusive as possible. So again, that's gcatoolkit.org/journalists. Without making this too narrow of a focus, we brought two special guests. This isn't only just for investigative reporters or politics reporters. Really, a lot of people can stand to use these tools, and we want to explain a little bit why that is. Joining me now, Hannah Datta. She researches the global governance of cybersecurity at the University College London. Before that, she was the head of cybersecurity and IT risk at the Financial Times. She previously worked in the UK government in a similar capacity for many years. So thanks for joining us, Ahana. Also with us, we have Runa Sandovic. She works on digital security for journalists and other high-risk people, and she builds on that experience in journalism at the New York Times. She worked at the New York Times, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and the Tor Project. She's a board member of the Norwegian Online News Association. Thanks as well for joining us, Runa. So I'm going to pose this open question. The world is facing a lot of challenges, right? And journalists especially. I'm in the United States. I think many of our viewers are in the United States. 9,000 journalists have lost their jobs in the last year. Coronavirus is making things worse. Everybody is Debbie Downer. Everything's really sad. Then, in addition to the cybersecurity, there's climate change, forest fires, hurricanes. There's an election in the US that we've never seen before. There are challenges to democracy around the world and human rights that we've never seen before. Why should journalists take a minute to look at their own cybersecurity posture? So let's start with you, Runa.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of the panel. I think the toolkit looks great, and I'm happy to be here as well. I would say that it's not necessarily the case that cybersecurity should take any precedent over what's happening today, but I think it's important to remember that cybersecurity can help support and complement the work that is going on today. So we're looking at ways to securely organize, to securely communicate, to securely share information. Even just looking at like the COVID tracking apps that have been released in different countries, there's a lot of talks about like, how do you do that in a secure manner? How do you launch a type of tracking app that allows someone to know whether they have been exposed to COVID in the past, 7 days or so, without that also meaning that someone like a government has the ability to figure out who you are and where you are and who you're interacting with at any point in time. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that digital security is something that supports and sort of underpins everything that we do. It's not necessarily the case that it sort of takes any precedent or priority over any of those things.
Yeah, Hannah, what do you think about that in terms of priorities seem to be so dispersed? There's so many people who try to wear many hats, and there's so many crises, and journalism is like a game of crisis management. Cybersecurity, why should we pay attention to that?
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Julian, for that very kind introduction. Well, I think it's slightly counterproductive to view cybersecurity as yet another thing that you've got to look after. You wouldn't be asking the same question of social media, or you wouldn't be asking the same question of using laptops or phones in the first place to be able to do your job. I think recently there was an interview in The Guardian with the writer Margaret Atwood, and she said, and I paraphrase here, that it's never been more important to speak truth to power. You better be sure that it is the truth. And in sort of this age of disinformation, misinformation, I think we have a collective responsibility to make sure that we use whatever resources we have at our disposal. And I think quite sort of small and practical tips, they demystify this, quite sort of mysterious world of cybersecurity. And it isn't unattainable at the cost of these other issues that you speak about.
So sort of as Runa mentioned, the only way we have to communicate, say, about a global pandemic or about elections or about climate change or about human rights, I mean, I can go down the laundry list, is mediated through the internet. So if the internet is compromised, then our ability to discuss those important issues is also compromised. Is that an accurate kind of reason to care about the health of our internet infrastructure?
Absolutely, and it's particularly a good way to care about sort of your own integrity. I think in the absence of taking any sort of personal cybersecurity measures, you're putting yourself at risk, and therefore your work and the news at risk. So in the context of that, it shouldn't be a competing priority. It should be as important as just being able to do your job. And hopefully, with this brilliant toolkit that you've put together, we can make that an easier thing to do.
Sure, and I really hope people check it out. We're unveiling it today, gcatoolkit.org/journalists. I'm curious, I have gone online, I have gotten the inevitable email that I think everybody's gotten, that your data has been compromised. I think if you've shopped online at one of those stores or something like that, my alma mater was compromised recently. It's like you can't help it, and yet I have access to my accounts. Nobody's impersonated me, as far as I know. Is it a numbers game? I don't know if Megan or Runa, is it just a game of chance that I'm playing with, or is there, and is that okay, or is there something a little bit more risky when I just accept my vulnerability online?
Megan, do you want to go first?
I was hoping Runa would like to go first, but no, is it a game of chance? I suppose it's not a risk game that I'm interested in taking. Numbers of folks have made the comment, and it's become cliche, but it's really not, shouldn't be taken as lightly to say there are two types of entities out there, whether it's humans or corporations or nonprofit entities. Those who know they've been compromised and those who've been compromised but just don't know it. And it's not our goal here to spread FUD. Rather, it's our goal here to equip users with means and resources to gain greater control and management over the risks that they face while they're online. So it may be the case, as was the case with the recent compromise of a number of, basically a software as a service entity that supports nonprofit and universities and healthcare services. We know that these breaches can occur and they may not actually, they may not be discovered for, I lost track of the latest statistic, but it can go on for almost a year before an entity discovers that they've been breached. So if your data is resting with one of these entities, you may have been breached, but you may not know it yet, which is different a little bit than what we're talking about with necessarily with the toolkit here. We're suggesting that we're recommending that users take steps to protect themselves, their devices, and their assets as a way to, among other things, as we've talked about, protect their reputations. But being careful with whom you share data, particularly organizations that shopping resources elsewhere, dating apps. The more your data is shared, the more it's out there, the greater potential risk it is for you. And I know that's actually going to be partially a conversation in the next session with Harlow Holmes and Victoria Vilk. They're going to be talking about protecting yourself from doxing and the like. So I kick it back to Runa because I know she has more to say on this.
So I think you made a lot of really good points. I would also compare it to, like, if you're, let's say that you're protecting a source in the physical space, right? There's a difference then between writing down the source's full name and everything that they have provided to you and everything that they've said in interviews in your notebook and carry that with you every day, versus only ever meeting them in a empty garage in the evenings on the weekends. And use code names. Like, it would be easier then for someone to figure out who your source is if you're just writing down all that information, versus if they then also have to take steps to figure out when you're meeting them and where you're meeting them and how often and how you're deciding where to meet. And similarly, that would work online as well. There's a big difference between how easy or how difficult it would be for me as an attacker to get into Julian's email, for example, if his password is password versus something longer and more unique, and if he also has 2FA on the account. And I think that to some extent, yes, there's a bit of a numbers game and some chance, but I think that there are steps that we as individuals and also as organizations can take to make it more difficult to be successfully attacked.
I want to ask you a little bit, Ahana, about that confidence question. Megan mentioned dating apps, and people are like, oh, wait, but I use my personal email on my dating app, but I have a professional email, and these are discrete worlds. And you know, I want to hear from the audience. In fact, if anybody's out there who has gotten that email that says you have been breached, whether it's, you know, a personal account you use or elsewhere, whether you thought about the implications of that or not. I mean, I certainly haven't many times. So it seems to think to a lot of people, Ahana, that the security infrastructure is working, even though it's one of those things where you don't notice if it's working. And therefore, if you don't notice it's working, you might not notice when it's not working, or when your personal and your private life kind of melds together. So how do I know if something's working, Ahana, or if it's not working?
That's a very good question. And I think most people in our professions that Runa or I share would probably consider cybersecurity technology a bit of a thankless job, because you only know when things are not working because you get a phone call in the middle of the night. But you don't really get told that, oh, you know, it is working. So it's quite hard to tell. Having said that, I don't think that that sort of demarcation that you mentioned between a personal and private being on the internet is necessarily the arbiter of this. You know, we create an internet fingerprint based on all the data that we put out there. And it is not a particularly difficult task to sort of take all of that information together to build a picture of who you are, regardless of whether that's in your work or personal life. But as Runa and Megan mentioned, I think it's a matter of bringing the baseline up, because especially for journalists, I think in this case, it's not only the means, it's also the motive. Whether you're talking about nation states or you're talking about someone just out to troll you. And so to be able to protect yourself to a degree, you have to think about why you might be targeted, and if it's a sensible thing to do to keep increasing your internet fingerprint based on who you are and what you do.
Now we got a question from the audience, and perhaps Megan, I could pose it to you first to give us a kind of a broad snapshot across industries, and then we can go to Runa and Ahana. What are some of the biggest and most impactful security breaches in the last few years? Let's start wide, and then we'll get to journalism or your personal experiences, Ahana and Runa. But Megan, more broadly in the internet world.
It's unfortunate that we have so many to choose from, but I think really the way I think about sort of what's been the biggest is those that have targeted companies that really then the compromise of which those companies undermine our trust in technology, or that are core components of other parts of our lives. So I think, as some folks may know, I'm a former government employee. I held a security clearance. My information was compromised when the Office of Personnel Management was breached in 2015. And to a point Ahana made a minute ago, when different types of data sets are compromised, oftentimes by the same actor, but potentially compromised by one actor and then given to dispersed in various places on the internet, that gives bad guys, we'll call them for lack of a better, more descriptive word, multiple opportunities to piece together parts of my life, which then gives them the opportunity to do all kinds of bad things to me, my family, my contacts. When you get a security clearance, you have to go back many years in your life, where you live, the people that you used as references. So unfortunately, that creates potentially a big vulnerability for not only the employees whose data was compromised, but also all of their associates with whom they included on their profile. Another big one in the United States was Equifax, and the reason I use that is because most people have to, in order to get a credit card, et cetera, we share this information with the bank. The bank then pulls a credit rating from one of these data brokers, one of these credit rating agencies, and again, it's not something you can give up. Now, you don't have to go through a security clearance in the case of OPM, but other data, in order to be a government employee or to be referred, is compromised. Likewise, Equifax, in order to obtain credit to support your family, potentially, you may be feeling like, gosh, is there anything I can do safely online anymore? Way back when, but still, I think, post 2010, we had the Target breach, which made folks kind of wake up and start thinking about third-party risk. But I'd say we know today that there's really still a big problem with third-party risk. And one recent example of that was the breach that Blackbaud experienced a couple weeks ago, which is the one that Julia mentioned a couple of minutes ago as well, which compromised the databases upon which a number of doing good entities use. So again, someone's donating money to thinking they're being helpful and doing a good thing, and unfortunately then their data is compromised by a breach, and in that case it was ransomware, and we can talk about that if we need to. But these types of breaches, I think, while they may not be the biggest in terms of numbers, can have an outsized impact when it comes to trust in the internet itself.
Runa, you have some experience in the New York Times. Does that kind of distrust in the infrastructure translate to journalism? I know journalism has other issues. And what are some of the challenges you've run up against and breaches that you've had to kind of seal up, or attacks you've had to fight off, or and kind of do to protect journalists and their ability to do their work?
So I think it's an interesting question, in that it also asks about impactful breaches. And so the sort of question that I would pose is impactful to whom? There are certainly, a lot of articles were written about Target and Equifax, but to what extent did they actually lead to deeper discussions on a board level, on a leadership level at a company? One example is when think this was like 2 years ago, there was a printing plant, like a newspaper print plant in the US that was hit with ransomware that then impacted I think like the LA Times' ability to actually get the printed paper out. And they then have to like spin up this additional like business continuity process to figure out like, what do we do now? How do we get the paper out? Like, how do we ensure that it is as full as we intended it to be? And I think that security breaches, when they happen within your specific industry, are great examples and then drivers for other entities within the same industry to sort of level up, to think of it sort of more around like how they can handle things better, what kind of gaps they have. Similarly, if a media organization accidentally burns source, I think that is something that does start a conversation in other newsrooms as well, in a way that the Target breach perhaps did not.
Mm. Now, Ahana, you wrote a really interesting article in the Columbia Journalism Review about some of the stuff that you've been up against, and it sounds like, or it sounded like when I read the article, that some people that you were working with, journalists, were surprised that they had been compromised. They thought that it was some other issue. What are some of the kind of ways in which you see the way journalists are compromised work, and perhaps in ways that journalists don't expect, because maybe their perception of hacking comes from movies or whatever?
That's a very interesting question. I think anyone wouldn't want to presume that they've been hacked as sort of the first point of call. I think anyone would want to think, or it's easier to think that, I must have done something silly, or something else has happened to explain all of this. No one ever anticipates, a state actor targeting them, or someone even lesser, because why would they? And quite right. But I think some of the ways in which we see this quite often is in the simplest ways. And the reason it's in the simplest ways and the opportunistic ways is because, as journalists, I'm sure, you're dealing with so much noise at any given point in time. You're dealing with so much information constantly. It is the easiest thing to do to use means of opportunism, like social engineering or phishing or things like that, to then get to the point where a compromise happens. And I suppose what you can do about it is it depends. So I'm sure a large part of the audience is also freelance. Not a lot of you might work at sort of big newspaper outlets or so on. You might not have the resources to depend on a team to protect yourselves. And I think that's really important, where it isn't about the defenses of your company as much as the little things that you can do for yourself. There's a common refrain that I hear that if someone really, really, really wants to hack you, they'll succeed in doing that. But you don't particularly want to make it easy for them, do you? Because if you make it easy for them, it also opens you up to all sorts of other actors that are fairly trivial. I don't know how much that goes in answering your question, Julian.
Well, one of the things you posed in the article was that your phone the battery might drain very quickly, and that might not necessarily be. We hear all this news about managed obsolescence or planned obsolescence. So is it Apple that's trying to get me to buy a new iPhone, or is it a hacker installing some sort of malware onto my phone? It's kind of hard to tell.
I think it's important to sort of remember that means and motive thing. If you're working on a particularly sensitive story, for instance, there's enough motive to then be suspicious of a battery that suddenly starts draining that wasn't doing so before. Perhaps more so if you were just working on something fairly innocuous. So it's so driven by context. And the other thing I don't want to do is to necessarily generalize the way in which you might perceive an attack. These things are always evolving; they're always changing. But if anything unusual happens, then that has to be taken within the context of, well, what are you working on, and that defines what the risk is, and that defines, how much effort you put into protecting yourself.
Sure, thank you. Runa, I couldn't help but notice your shirt, "Dissent is Patriotic." And it brings me to something I hear a lot at journalism conferences, and that is just the principles of free speech, that really serve as like the bedrock of journalism, especially speech that is controversial. So I wanted to ask, somewhat of an ethical question. On one hand, we're trying to protect journalists by giving them tools and the ability to encrypt their data, have encrypted communication, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, journalists often celebrate transparency, and the kind of transparency that sometimes comes out of breaches. So how do we manage that one expectation of having a robust kind of free speech environment where what's government doing, the private sector's doing, is right and in the interest of the public that journalists are serving, versus journalists also understanding the need to protect data, to shield data, and so on. It seems a little contradictory. Is it, or is it not?
I don't think it is. I think that if hacked information is released online and it is newsworthy, then you should absolutely report on it. And sort of just connecting back to what we talked about earlier, you should still take steps to make it more difficult for someone to go after the information that you have and the information about who you're communicating with, when, for how long, and about what. Just because you're reporting on information that has been leaked or obtained through unauthorized means doesn't mean that you should be any more lax in the steps that you take on your end.
It's interesting that you mention protecting your own data. We got a question from the audience a little bit about journalistic harassment, online harassment, and some of that can happen just because people are jerks or because they have a respectful disagreement, although more often than not, people are jerks. But then there are also ways in which that cyber vulnerability is used to harass. So doxing comes to mind, the practice where your personal details are released as, either as punishment or to kind of, blackmail you into not publishing a story. How are ways in which journalists can manage their online presence in order to specifically prevent the kind of harassment, the kind of releasing of personal details that would get in the way of doing journalism in a kind of ethical and upstanding way? I pose the question to the room. Who wants to hop in?
Well, perhaps I'll start with the first step, and perhaps I'll do that because I've been trying over the past many years to not have an internet footprint at all. So, I'm trying not to have sort of any social media or anything. But I think the first step to preventing harassment is knowing what about you is out there. I think, it's very difficult to protect and prevent harassment if you don't quite know what bits of information you might be posing as potential avenues for harassment. So I think if I were to start somewhere, the first step would be what is the information about me that exists out there?
Sure, and there's going to be a really interesting session later this hour, a little bit about doxing and protecting information. There's also neat resources. There's Professor Michelle Ferrier, who works in this area as well, and a lot of the tools in the toolkit at GCA Toolkit.org/journalists that you can use in part to kind of protect yourself. Of course, Ahana, as you mentioned, it's not an option for every journalist to not have social media. I mean, social media is so important to work in communication when 90% of news is consumed on the internet. Half of news consumed on Facebook. It's just stunning how dependent the news is on social media. We have another question from the audience, just because we only have a few minutes left. And Runa, I think you have some interesting insights on this. How do journalists cover, or how should they cover, certain groups that are responsible for hacking in negative ways, right? Not in ways that amplify human rights abuses, but perhaps ways that empower, regimes that deny human rights to certain populations, things like that. How do you report on those groups, or even amateur groups, or kind of semi-professional groups, without also kind of seeming to celebrate the work that they're doing if it's harmful?
I'd like the first thing that comes to mind there is to report the facts, the pieces of the story that you've been able to verify, that you can back up, and not to make, if possible, any leaps, any assumptions. If you are making assumptions, that should be stated very, very clearly, and to not sensationalize or clickbait the story. I think that it's just like a fine line there between reporting the facts, reporting what you've been able to verify, potentially also share what you haven't been able to verify, or what still seems a bit unclear or suspicious or conflicting, and try and navigate it that way.
Ahana, do you have advice on how to not necessarily amplify bad behavior while also communicating what's going on?
Yeah, I think sort of in another perspective, the style of reporting is more of an editorial decision. Having said that, I think there's a way to prioritize means over motive in this. I don't know why I'm sort of stuck with those sort of three words, but it's really important to not be able to sensationalize these things. Is to, as Runa said, focus on the facts, and the facts come from the means rather than the motive. The motive is where the avenue for sensationalism might be more prevalent, if that makes sense. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I suppose, is I think there's, and this is quite innocent, right? But whenever there's a story about a hacker group or whatever, there's almost always a picture of this shadowy person, with sort of green, matrix style neon numbers, and they're just sort of they've got their hoodie on, typing away. I think we've got to dispel that sort of imagery. These are very normal, reasonable, in most cases, quite nerdy people. So let's not make them sexy.
Yeah, too. I think just. Oh,
go
sorry,
ahead, Megan. I was gonna ask you about what would what's a piece of advice from you, Megan?
In covering the breaches and the like, I would say,
Sure.
I'm hopeful. I would hope that journalists would as they're covering the facts, that they would try not to spread what we call FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? Oh my gosh, this happened. You're never going to be safe online again. Those types of clickbait headlines and the like are not actually as effective as you might want to think. But I think not only covering the facts, but also talking about, if you can, and I would encourage you to reach out to Runa or Ahana or others to find out what steps could have been taken to reduce the likelihood that this breach could have happened in the first place, what steps can be taken to remediate it. give part of the solution and not just the problem, because it's solutions that are going to build confidence in the internet. It's solutions that are going to then build confidence in democracy and the use of the internet to enhance and support democracy and support journalists as they try to do so. And so let's lead with the facts and let's provide solutions.
Cool. Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do with the toolkit, which you can find on our website, gcatoolkit.org/journalists. Now, Runa and Ahana, we're about to wrap up, but if you were to give one piece of advice in a short little nugget, a phrase or two to either a seasoned journalist who still writes in a hard notebook and still uses a typewriter, or a brand new journalist who's just graduating from journalism school, what advice do you have for them to protect themselves and make sure their work reaches the people they're supposed to reach and protect their sources?
Who do you want to go first?
I see the gears turning. I know
it's very
it's a lot.
It's quite hard to distill all of that into sort of one little nugget, isn't it? But I think from my experience, I would probably say if you can, try not to become disenfranchised with the possibility of being hacked. I think the work that will endure is more important than worrying about all of that. So that is sort of one piece of advice, and then sort of another quick bolt on to that is that if you've got 30 seconds in your day, just add multi-factor authentication to everything.
Awesome. That's very good advice. Runa?
I completely agree, and I think that I would add to that by saying that there are a lot of toolkits out there that do provide step-by-step guidance to best practice. And I think it can initially perhaps feel a bit overwhelming because there's so much, and it can sort of seem like there's so many steps to take. But I think it's important to remember that securing your online life is more like shifting a lifestyle. It's not that it's something you can sit down and do in 5 minutes or do on a Saturday. You can secure 3 accounts today and then 3 accounts next week, and then just continue adding to that so that over time you are shifting how you work online and how you communicate and how you do your work, as opposed to throwing everything up in the air today.
Well, thanks so much. And we're really glad to have you, Runa and Ahana. Thank you, Megan, for shepherding this toolkit, this journalist toolkit through. It has a lot of those tools that Runa and Ahana talked about. It's structured in a way that you can implement these things between your deadlines. It's super manageable. I was a total newbie before I came to the GCA, and I imagine most journalists out there are also when it comes to cybersecurity. So please do feel free to reach out to the Global Cyber Alliance, to our wonderful panelists. We'll be on GRIP as well, or at least I will, and I'll be able to point you in the right direction. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, and thanks for the work that journalists do and cybersecurity people do, because it keeps things flowing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.